Thank you so much, Rod. I appreciate that. And Steve, your comments are greatly appreciated as well. What a great evening this is, and to have this space dedicated to Walter Cronkite. I'm especially delighted that members of Walter Cronkite's family are here with us, especially my good friends Kate and Chip. I'm sorry that your late wonderful mother, Betsy, and your dad couldn't be here with us too. I know they would have had a great time. I'm thrilled, as I said, that the university is naming this prominent space on our campus in honor of Walter Cronkite, who was one of the giants in the history of journalism. My relationship with Walter spanned only the last 20 years of his life, but I was fortunate that our relationship was not only close professionally, but also personally. As his oral historian, researcher, friend, and curator of his papers, which, as Steve pointed out and Rod pointed out, are archived at the Briscoe Center, I had the unique opportunity to assist Walter in producing his memoir, A Reporter's Life, and over the years of our friendship, to engage him in candid discussions about his views on journalism. Now, we're celebrating Walter's legacy today, not only by the naming of this plaza, but also by the placement of 4 plaques here representing the cardinal virtues of journalism that Walter personified throughout his professional career. Now, because the vast majority, if you do the math here, because the vast majority of our students weren't even born when Walter left his anchor post on the CBS Evening News in 1981, 31 years ago now, I thought it would be appropriate to cite specific examples from Walter's career that illustrate these 4 virtues of accuracy, courage, independence, and integrity. And I should point out that you could fill a book with examples that document Walter's strict adherence to professional standards. So the examples I'll cite are very selective. I'll begin with accuracy, which is the plaque over here. When I thought about selecting one example of why Walter had such a well-earned reputation for accuracy, the first thing that popped into my mind was his coverage of the assassination of President John F. Kennedy on that terrible November day, nearly 50 years ago. Walter was a firm believer in the double source rule for reporting news, and if the news was especially important, he preferred more than 2 sources before he felt confident about the accuracy of a report. That rule was actually a special burden to Walter because of his intense desire to scoop his competition. He was one of the most competitive individuals I've ever known at every level. Despite his love of the news scoop and beating the competition, he still followed the multiple source rule religiously. His announcement of Kennedy's death is an excellent example of that. All the television networks reported details of the shooting as they came in. But the critical question was the president's condition. Was he dead or alive? The immediate future of the nation, perhaps even the free world, relied on the answer to that vital question. No one knew who had shot the president or whether it was part of a larger attack on the United States. The CBS affiliate in Dallas was the first to report that a physician at Parkland Hospital had claimed that Kennedy was dead. But Cronkite, in the absence of other sources, refused to report it on the air. He later told me that his immediate thought was, well, what if Kennedy isn't really dead? What if KRLD's report was based simply on a doctor's assumption rather than fact? Soon, United Press quoted a Secret Service agent that he thought Kennedy was dead. But Cronkite also refrained from airing that report. When CBS correspondent Dan Rather sent word that a priest had claimed that Kennedy was dead, Cronkite reported that. But when he did, he also stressed that this was based on secondhand information and could not be confirmed. Finally, Cronkite was handed a report from UPI's Merriman Smith. It was the long-anticipated additional source for which Walter had waited during those intense minutes after the news of the attack on the president. It was only then that Walter, now confident of the accuracy of the information, made what was perhaps the most famous announcement of his life. From Dallas, Texas, the flash, apparently official, President Kennedy died at 1 p.m. Central Standard Time, 2 o'clock Eastern Standard Time, some 30 minutes ago. Another virtue is courage. Cronkite displayed personal physical courage on many occasions, notably during his service as a war correspondent during World War II, covering the U.S. 8th Air Force and the Battle of the Bulge. Whenever he and I talked about the war, Walter usually preferred to tell humorous stories on himself. For example, when I asked him what the Battle of the Bulge was like, he remembered a particular firefight in a little Belgian town. Walter said, "Don, the fighting was very intense. My driver and I hopped out of our Jeep and got behind a doorway. The Germans were at one end of the main street, and it was a pretty good shootout. I looked up and saw a GI leaning out taking a shot or two. Of course, I knew this would make a great story. I yelled out, 'What's your name, soldier?' He replied, 'Colonel James.' I said, 'Where are you from? What outfit are you with?' He said, 'Mr. Cronkite, I'm your driver.'" But for professional courage, I would cite Cronkite's controversial statement in 1968 at the end of his CBS special report on Vietnam, and that the war was a stalemate, and that it was, to quote Cronkite, "increasingly clear that the only rational way out will be to negotiate not as victors, but as an honorable people who lived up to their pledge to defend democracy and did the best they could." By this stage of his career, Cronkite was the major figure of broadcast journalism's establishment. President Lyndon Johnson's reaction to Cronkite's editorial was, "If I've lost Cronkite, I've lost the country." David Halberstam later noted that it was the first time in American history that a war had been declared over by a commentator. Today, with our radically different, highly opinionated news media, it's difficult for us to appreciate the courage it took for Walter to endanger his position as America's #1 news personality and the perks that flowed from that position to take such a controversial public stance about the war. And he received tremendous criticism from the war hawks for it. And then we have the virtue of independence, which in Cronkite's case was his fervent belief in the essential importance of an independent news media to a democracy. In 1969, when President Richard Nixon launched a full-scale attack on his perceived enemies in the press, Cronkite took a prominent role in the fight to defend freedom of the press. Cronkite gave a series of widely reported speeches denouncing the Nixon administration for trying to control the news and destroy the credibility of the press. He publicly scolded Nixon and his palace guard, quote, for committing a crime against the people by trying to prevent television news from doing its job as the people's observer of the performance of their elected representatives, unquote. The leadership role that Cronkite assumed in defending an independent news media earned him the gratitude of an entire generation of journalists. And finally, we have the virtue of professional integrity, in which a critical ingredient is the concept of objectivity. Croncott's belief in objectivity in reporting the news and his standards of integrity were symbolized by this famous phrase that we are repeating many times tonight, and for which this work of art is named for, and that he used as his sign-off. At the end of each evening news broadcast, Walter would declare, "And that's the way it is," whatever date it was, he would say. That famous sign-off is an example of Croncott's sense of integrity for a reason you probably don't know. Not long after Cronkite began using the sign-off, it occurred to him and his boss, Dick Salant, that the viewers might understandably assume that the phrase, "and that's the way it is," certified not only that all the news that was worth reporting had been reported, but also that everything reported had been reported without error. But when he tried to drop the sign-off, he couldn't. It had become too popular. Walter later told me that sign-off has been much criticized by serious television critics because of the argument that it was presumptive, that everything we said was correct. I agree. I shouldn't have said that. One of Walter's favorite cartoons was from the New Yorker magazine. He showed it to me a couple of times. He cut it out. It depicted a man jumping halfway out of his chair with his fist in the air, shouting at his television, saying, "No, that's not the way it is." He loved that cartoon. I share this anecdote about Cronkite's concern about his famous sign-off because, to me, it's a prime example of just how serious he was about journalistic ethics. You know, it's hard to imagine that many of our current stars in broadcast journalism would spend even a microsecond worried about the ethics of a sign-off. As a historian, I want to point out that these four journalistic virtues that Walter Cronkite embodied are the same virtues to which those of us who write history also try to follow. Indeed, they are the virtues of all humanists. And indeed, that is ultimately what Walter Cronkite really was, a dedicated journalist who was also a true humanist in his professional as well as his personal life. It was that combination of professionalism and humanism that his viewers could see and understand, and that earned him the title of most trusted man in America. Walter, if you can hear me now, and that's the way it really is. Thank you.